In the shadowed corridors of power, where whispers carry more weight than proclamations, a single letter would change the course of a royal family forever. What happens when the last bridge between estranged brothers burns not in private, but before the watchful eyes of those sworn to protect them? Sometimes the most devastating battles are fought not with swords, but with words that can never be taken back. This is the story of how a final attempt at reconciliation became the very thing that sealed a family's fate. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle like secrets reluctant to be revealed. Inside the castle's east wing, William Charles paced the length of his private study, his footsteps echoing against walls that had witnessed centuries of royal decisions. The weight of his position seemed heavier today, pressing down on shoulders that had learned to carry the burden of expectation since childhood. On his mahogany desk lay a single sheet of cream-colored paper, the royal watermark barely visible in the pale morning light. He had started and discarded a dozen versions of this letter over the past week, each attempt feeling inadequate for the magnitude of what he was trying to accomplish. This was to be his final attempt at reaching his younger brother Harry, whose departure from royal duties had left a chasm in the family that seemed to grow wider with each passing month. The relationship between the brothers had once been unbreakable. They had weathered their mother's death together, stood side by side through countless public appearances, and shared private jokes that outsiders would never understand. But somewhere along the way, the pressures of their positions, the scrutiny of the media, and perhaps most damaging of all, the influence of those around them had driven a wedge between them that seemed impossible to remove. William picked up his fountain pen, the same one his grandfather had given him on his 18th birthday, and began to write. The words flowed from a place of genuine pain and hope, each sentence carefully crafted to bridge the gap that had formed between them. He wrote about their shared memories, about the promise they had made to their mother to always protect each other, and about his deep regret over the misunderstandings that had torn them apart. As he wrote, William thought about the events that had led to this moment. Harry's marriage had been a turning point, bringing someone new into their tight-knit family circle who saw things differently. The initial joy of the wedding had gradually been replaced by tensions over roles, responsibilities, and the relentless pressure of public life. What had started as minor disagreements had escalated into major rifts, with neither brother willing to back down from positions that had become entrenched over time. The letter grew longer as William poured his heart onto the page. He acknowledged his own mistakes, the times he had failed to understand Harry's perspective or support him when he needed it most. He wrote about the loneliness of his position, how the weight of future kingship sometimes made him feel isolated even from those closest to him. Most importantly, he wrote about love, the brotherly love that he believed still existed beneath all the hurt and anger. Outside his study, the castle was beginning to come alive with the day's activities. Servants moved quietly through the corridors, groundskeepers tended to the gardens, and security personnel took their positions for another day of protecting the royal family. Among them was James Morrison, a guard who had served the family for over a decade. James had seen the brothers grow from young men into their current roles, and he had noticed the change in their relationship with the keen eye of someone who spent his days observing and protecting. James had been assigned to the East Wing that morning, a routine posting that he had carried out hundreds of times before. He took pride in his discretion and professionalism, understanding that his role required him to be both vigilant and invisible. The royal family's privacy was something he guarded as carefully as their physical safety. As William finished his letter, he felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. This was his olive branch, his final attempt to reach across the divide and reconnect with his brother. He folded the letter carefully, placing it in an envelope that bore the royal seal. The weight of it in his hands seemed disproportionate to its physical mass, heavy with the importance of what it represented. The decision to deliver the letter personally rather than through official channels was deliberate. William wanted Harry to understand that this communication came from his heart, not from his position as heir to the throne. He wanted to strip away the formality and protocol that so often complicated their interactions and speak to Harry simply as his older brother. William made his way through the castle corridors, the letter tucked securely in his jacket pocket. His mind raced with thoughts of how Harry might receive it, whether the words he had chosen would resonate or fall on deaf ears. The distance between them was not just measured in miles between England and California, but in the emotional gulf that had opened up over months of silence and misunderstanding. The morning sun was beginning to burn through the mist as William approached the section of the castle where he knew he would find a guard station. His plan was simple. Ask one of the trusted guards to ensure the letter was delivered through secure channels, bypassing the usual bureaucratic processes that might delay or compromise its delivery. As he walked, William reflected on the irony of his situation. Here he was, a man destined to rule over millions, yet unable to bridge a simple gap with his own brother. The public saw them as symbols of stability and continuity, but privately they were just two men struggling to understand each other across the divide created by circumstance, choice, and the relentless pressure of their extraordinary lives. The guard station was located in a part of the castle that few visitors ever saw, tucked away behind the public areas where the real work of protecting the royal family took place. It was here that duty rosters were planned, security briefings conducted, and the quiet vigilance that kept the family safe was coordinated. William had been there before on official business, but never for something as personal as this. James Morrison was reviewing the morning security reports when he noticed Prince William approaching. He immediately stood to attention, as protocol demanded, but there was something different about this visit. The prince's demeanor was less formal than usual, and there was an intensity in his eyes that suggested this was not routine business. The atmosphere in the guard station shifted palpably as William entered the room. James Morrison and his colleague, Sarah Chun, a relatively new addition to the security team who had proven herself exceptionally capable, both stood at attention. The small room, lined with monitors and communication equipment, suddenly felt charged with an energy that neither guard could quite identify. William's usual commanding presence was tempered by something more vulnerable today. James, with his years of experience reading the subtle signs of royal moods, recognized the telltale signs of internal struggle. The prince's jaw was set in a way that suggested determination mixed with uncertainty, and his hands moved restlessly, a trait James had observed during other moments of personal difficulty. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," James said formally, though his tone carried the warmth that came from years of mutual respect. Sarah echoed the greeting, her posture perfect despite the nervous energy that William's unexpected presence had triggered. "James, Sarah," William acknowledged them both with a nod. "I need to ask for your assistance with something rather personal." The word hung in the air between them, unusual in its intimacy within the context of their professional relationship. James had served the royal family long enough to know that personal requests were rare and significant. In his decade of service, he could count on one hand the number of times a member of the royal family had asked for help with something outside the scope of official duties. Each instance had been memorable, creating moments of human connection that transcended the usual boundaries of their relationship. William reached into his jacket and, withdrew the envelope. The morning light streaming through the room's single window caught the royal seal, making it gleam with an almost symbolic weight. "I've written a letter to my brother," he began, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and resignation. "I need it delivered, but not through the usual channels. This is my final attempt to reach him." The phrase "final attempt" resonated in the small room like a bell tolling. James felt the weight of what was being entrusted to them. In his years of service, he had witnessed the gradual deterioration of the relationship between the two brothers, had seen the way their interactions had become increasingly formal and strained during public appearances. The joy and easy camaraderie that had once characterized their relationship had been replaced by careful politeness and barely concealed tension. Sarah, despite her relative newness to the position, had heard the stories from other guards about how close the brothers had once been. The older members of the security team often spoke fondly of the days when William and Harry would joke together, play pranks on the staff, and display the kind of natural brotherly affection that made their protection duties feel less like work and more like caring for extended family. "Of course, Your Royal Highness," James replied without hesitation. "We'll ensure it reaches Prince Harry safely and discreetly." William's relief was visible, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he handed over the envelope. "Thank you," he said, and there was genuine gratitude in his voice. "This means more to me than you might realize." As William began to explain the specifics of how he wanted the letter delivered, James noticed something that would later prove significant. The prince's emotional state was affecting his usual careful attention to protocol. Normally, such a sensitive communication would be handled in complete privacy, but William's vulnerability was making him less guarded than usual. "I've tried everything else," William continued, his voice growing more personal with each word. "Phone calls that go unanswered, messages through intermediaries that get lost in translation. This letter contains things I should have said months ago, admissions I should have made, apologies that are long overdue." Sarah found herself deeply moved by the prince's openness. In her training, she had been prepared for many scenarios, but witnessing such raw emotion from someone she was meant to protect created a complex mix of professional duty and human empathy. She understood that she was being granted a glimpse into a private world that few people ever saw. William began to pace the small confines of the guard station, his composure further unraveling as he spoke. "In this letter, I've acknowledged my failures as a brother. I've written about how the pressures of our positions have made me lose sight of what really matters. I've told him that I understand why he felt he had to leave, even if I disagree with how he did it." James exchanged a glance with Sarah. They were both beginning to realize that this was more than a simple delivery request. This was a man unburdening himself to perhaps the only people in his immediate vicinity who could offer the kind of neutral, professional support he needed in this moment. "I've written about our mother," William continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "about the promise we made to her and how I feel we've both broken it by allowing this distance to grow between us. I've told him that I miss him, not as a duke or as a working royal, but as my brother." The emotion in William's voice was unmistakable now. Years of royal training had taught him to maintain composure in public. But here, in this small room with two trusted guards, his carefully maintained facade was cracking. The weight of his position, the pressure of the monarchy's future resting on his shoulders, and the personal pain of losing his closest family relationship were all converging in this moment. Sarah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes as she listened. The human drama unfolding before her was more compelling than any fictional story. made all the more powerful by the genuine pain she could see in William's expression. "I've also written about forgiveness," William went on, seemingly unaware of how much he was revealing. "I've asked for his forgiveness for the times I failed to support him, for the times I chose duty over brotherhood, for the times I let the institution come between us. And I've offered my own forgiveness for the things he said and done that have hurt our family." James realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in his years of service. Never before had he seen a member of the royal family so completely open about their personal struggles. The training that taught him to be invisible and discreet was warring with his human instinct to offer comfort to someone clearly in pain. The letter in his hands felt heavier with each revelation about its contents. This wasn't just correspondence between brothers. It was a document that laid bare the personal cost of public life, the way that duty and expectation could corrode even the strongest family bonds. "Most importantly," William said, turning to face both guards directly, "I've written about hope. Hope that we can find our way back to each other. Hope that the love we shared as children is still there underneath all the hurt and misunderstanding. Hope that it's not too late for us to be brothers again." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. James and Sarah both understood that they had been entrusted with far more than a simple delivery task. They had become, in this moment, the keepers of a royal family's most intimate struggles and desperate hopes. William seemed to suddenly realize how much he had revealed. The vulnerability that had been pouring out of him was replaced by a visible effort to regain his composure. "I apologize," he said, his voice returning to its more formal register. "I didn't mean to burden you with so much detail." "Not at all, Your Royal Highness," James assured him. "We understand the importance of what you're entrusting to us." But even as William attempted to return to his more controlled demeanor, the damage was done. Both guards had heard not just the contents of the letter, but the raw emotion behind it. They had witnessed a future king at his most human, most vulnerable moment. What none of them realized in that moment was that their conversation was being recorded by standard security protocols, and that this deeply personal revelation would soon take on a life of its own, transforming from a private moment of pain into a very public exposure of royal family dynamics. The secure communication room adjacent to the guard station hummed with the quiet efficiency of modern surveillance technology. Banks of monitors displayed feeds from across the castle grounds, while recording equipment captured every conversation for security analysis. It was a necessary part of protecting the royal family, but it also meant that privacy was often an illusion, even in moments when it was most desperately needed. Detective Inspector Margaret Walsh had been reviewing routine security footage when she noticed the unusual activity in the guard station. As head of internal security, it was her job to monitor all interactions involving the royal family, particularly those that deviated from normal protocol. What she was witnessing on the monitors was definitely not normal protocol. Margaret had served in law enforcement for over 20 years before being recruited to her current position. She had seen enough human drama to recognize when something significant was unfolding. The body language of everyone in that small room told her that this was no routine security briefing. She adjusted the audio levels and began to listen more carefully. What she heard made her sit forward in her chair with growing concern. Prince William was revealing intimate details about his relationship with Prince Harry. And worse, he was doing so in the presence of guards who, despite their discretion and loyalty, were still technically outsiders to the family's inner circle. Margaret understood the delicate balance her position required. She was sworn to protect the royal family, but that protection extended beyond physical safety to include their privacy and reputation. What she was witnessing had the potential to damage both if it were ever to become public. Back in the guard station, William had moved beyond simply describing the letter's contents to sharing memories and emotions that painted a vivid picture of the brothers' deteriorating relationship. "I remember the last time we really talked," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "It was before Harry's wedding. We were walking in Kensington Gardens, and for a moment it felt like old times. We were just two brothers planning for one of the happiest days of his life." James found himself drawn into the narrative despite his professional training. The prince's pain was palpable, and it was impossible not to feel empathy for someone struggling with such a fundamental human experience, the loss of a sibling relationship. "But even then, I could sense something changing," William continued. "There was a distance in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I told myself it was just wetting nerves, but I think I knew even then that something fundamental was shifting between us." Sarah struggled to maintain her professional composure as she listened. The training she had received had covered many scenarios, but nothing had prepared her for being a witness to such raw, emotional revelation. She understood that she was hearing things that few people in the world would ever know about the royal family's private dynamics. Margaret Walsh made a difficult decision. She activated the secure phone line that connected directly to the private secretary's office. Sir Edmund Hartwell had served the royal family for over 15 years and would know how to handle this delicate situation. The conversation needed to be documented, but it also needed to be contained. "Sir Edmund," Margaret spoke quietly into the phone, "we have a situation developing that requires your immediate attention. Prince William is in the East Wing guard station, and he's sharing rather personal information about his relationship with Prince Harry." Sir Edmund's response was immediate and sharp. "How personal? And who else is present?" "Guards Morrison and Chin are with him, and he's revealed significant details about a letter he's written to Prince Harry." "The conversation has moved well beyond professional boundaries, sir." There was a pause on the line as Sir Edmund processed this information. "Continue monitoring and recording. I'll be there within minutes. Under no circumstances is this information to leave that room until I arrive." Back in the guard station, William's emotional revelation continued to unfold. "I made so many mistakes," he said, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that revealed his stress. "There were times when I could have been more supportive, times when I chose the easy path of going along with others' expectations rather than standing up for what I knew was right for Harry." James felt increasingly uncomfortable with the level of personal detail he was hearing. His training told him that this kind of information could be dangerous if mishandled, not just for the royal family, but for anyone who became privy to it. Yet he also recognized that William seemed to desperately need to voice these feelings, as if speaking them aloud was the only way to process the pain. "The worst part," William continued, "is that I think our mother would be heartbroken if she could see us now. She always worried about us being there for each other, especially after she was gone. I feel like I've failed her memory by letting this happen." The mention of their late mother added another layer of poignancy to William's words. Both guards knew the story of how the brothers had supported each other through their mother's death and its aftermath. The idea that their current estrangement might be seen as a betrayal of her memory made the situation even more tragic. Margaret Walsh watched her monitors with growing anxiety. Sir Edmund's arrival couldn't come soon enough. She could see that William was becoming increasingly emotional, and the guards were clearly struggling with how to respond. This was spiraling beyond what any of them could handle. Sarah finally found her voice, speaking with careful respect. "Your Royal Highness, perhaps it would be best to continue this conversation in more private surroundings." William seemed to suddenly realize where he was and what he had been saying. The emotional release that had been pouring out of him was replaced by a look of horror as he comprehended how much he had revealed. "My God," he whispered, "what have I done?" The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had just shared the most intimate details of his family's struggles with staff members, had revealed information that could be devastating if it became public. The letter that was meant to be a private olive branch to his brother had become the center of a potential scandal. James stepped forward instinctively, recognizing the prince's distress. "Your Royal Highness, please be assured of our complete discretion. Nothing said in this room will go any further." But William's expression showed that he understood the gravity of what had just occurred. "You don't understand," he said, his voice filled with dawning panic. "If any of this becomes public, if Harry learns that I discussed our private matters with others, it won't just destroy my letter. It will destroy any chance we might have had of reconciliation." At that moment, Sir Edmund Hartwell arrived at the guard station. His usually composed demeanor showed cracks of stress as he quickly assessed the situation. "Your Royal Highness," he said with careful formality, "I think it might be best if we move this conversation to a more secure location." The appearance of the private secretary seemed to snap William back to the reality of his position and the protocols he had just violated. "Edmund," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his mistake, "I think I may have just made the situation with Harry infinitely worse." Sir Edmund's expression confirmed William's fears. "We need to discuss damage control immediately, sir. And we need to ensure that everyone present understands the sensitive nature of what has been shared here today." As the group prepared to leave the guard station, Margaret Walsh continued her careful documentation of the incident. She knew that in the coming hours and days, every detail of this conversation would be scrutinized by those responsible for protecting the royal family's interests. The letter that had begun as William's final olive branch to his brother had already become something else entirely. Evidence of a family in crisis and a potential source of scandal that could have far-reaching consequences. The irony was not lost on any of them. In trying to bridge the gap with Harry, William may have inadvertently created an even wider chasm. The weight of unintended consequences was beginning to settle over everyone involved. What had started as a simple request for help delivering a letter had become a complex crisis requiring careful management and absolute discretion. The final olive branch had not yet reached Harry, but it had already begun to wither under the harsh light of unintended exposure. Sir Edmund Hartwell's private office overlooked the castle's western gardens, but the beautiful view did nothing to calm the tension that filled the room. William sat slumped in one of the leather chairs, his head in his hands, while Sir Edmund paced behind his desk, his mind racing through the implications of what had just occurred. "Tell me exactly what was said," Sir Edmund requested, his voice maintaining its professional calm despite the gravity of the situation. William looked up, his face showing the full weight of his realization. "Everything, Edmund. I told them everything that was in the letter. The apologies, the regrets, the details about our last conversation, even what I wrote about our mother." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. Sir Edmund stopped pacing and faced his monarch directly. "Your Royal Highness, we need to be very clear about the scope of this exposure. Were there specific incidents mentioned? Private conversations with other family members? Anything that could be seen as criticism of the institution?" The questions came rapid fire, each one highlighting another potential area of vulnerability. William realized that his emotional outburst had not just betrayed his private correspondence with Harry, but had potentially exposed the entire family to scrutiny. "I mentioned the conversation Harry and I had about his role before he left," William admitted. I talked about the pressure from advisors, about feeling caught between family loyalty and duty to the crown. I may have. I may have implied that the institution's response to Harry's concerns was inadequate. Sir Edmund's expression darkened. This was worse than he had initially feared. Criticism of the institution's handling of Harry's departure was exactly the kind of information that could be weaponized by the media or by those with their own agendas. Meanwhile, in the guard station that had been hastily evacuated, Margaret Walsh was conducting her own damage assessment. She had isolated the audio and video recordings of the incident and was preparing a detailed report for Sir Edmund's review. As she transcribed the conversation, she was struck by how much damage could be done by a few minutes of unguarded honesty. James Morrison and Sarah Chun had been moved to a secure briefing room where they were receiving what amounted to an emergency session on confidentiality and its importance to national security. Detective Inspector Richard Hayes, Margaret's deputy, was handling their debriefing with the kind of serious intensity usually reserved for actual threats to royal safety. "I want to be absolutely clear," Hayes said, facing both guards with unwavering eye contact. "What you heard today does not exist. It was never said, you were never present for it, and if anyone ever asks you about private conversations involving the royal family, you know nothing." James, with his years of experience, understood the gravity of the situation. He had signed confidentiality agreements that carried serious legal consequences for violation. But Sarah, newer to the position, was struggling with the ethical complexities of what had occurred. "Sir," Sarah said carefully, "Prince William seemed to be in genuine distress. Shouldn't someone with appropriate counseling expertise be informed so he can receive proper support?" Hayes's expression softened slightly. "Ms. Chun, your concern for His Royal Highness is commendable, but there are established protocols for such situations. Your role is to maintain absolute confidentiality, not to make decisions about what support the royal family requires." Back in Sir Edmund's office, William was beginning to understand the full ramifications of his error. "The recording systems," he said suddenly, "all conversations in security areas are recorded for review." Sir Edmund nodded grimly. "Yes, and Detective Inspector Walsh is currently securing and analyzing those recordings. We need to determine exactly what was captured and what our options are for containing this information." The private secretary moved to his secure phone and dialed an extension. "Margaret, I need your preliminary assessment." "I see. Yes, bring the recordings here immediately. And ensure that all copies are accounted for." William watched this exchange with growing dread. "Edmund, if this becomes public, it won't just damage my relationship with Harry further. It could undermine confidence in the monarchy itself. The public will see that we can't even manage our own family relationships, let alone provide stable leadership for the nation. That's precisely why we need to handle this with extreme care," Sir Edmund replied. "But first, we need to understand what we're dealing with. When Margaret arrives with the recordings, we'll review them together and determine our options." The wait for Margaret's arrival felt interminable. William found himself replaying the morning's events, wondering how a simple desire to reconcile with his brother had spiraled into a potential constitutional crisis. The letter that still sat on Sir Edmund's desk seemed to mock him with its good intentions and inevitable futility. When Margaret finally arrived with a secure laptop containing the recordings, the atmosphere in the room became even more tense. "Your Royal Highness," she said with a slight bow, "I prepared a full transcript as well as the audio and video recordings. I should warn you that the content is quite revealing." As they played back the recordings, William was forced to confront the full extent of his indiscretion. Hearing his own voice revealing such intimate details was mortifying. Worse, he could see how his words could be taken out of context or misinterpreted to suggest things he had never intended. "There," he said suddenly, stopping the playback. "That section where I mentioned feeling unsupported by family advisors during Harry's departure. If that's heard by the wrong people, it could be interpreted as criticism of the Queen's handling of the situation." Sir Edmund made notes as they continued through the recording. Each revelation created new potential problems. William's admission that he sometimes felt isolated by his position could be seen as criticism of the support structures around him. His comments about the institutional response to Harry could be viewed as undermining official positions. The most damaging aspect, Sir Edmund observed, is not necessarily any single statement, but the overall picture it paints of internal family conflict and institutional dysfunction. This recording provides a roadmap for anyone seeking to attack the monarchy's stability. Margaret Walsh had prepared several options for dealing with the recordings. We could classify this under national security provisions, which would prevent any unauthorized access or distribution. However, that classification would require approval from the Cabinet Office and would create its own paper trail. What about the guards? William asked. What assurance do we have of their continued discretion? Both Morrison and Sean have exemplary records and have signed comprehensive confidentiality agreements, Margaret replied. However, the psychological pressure of keeping such significant information secret can be considerable. We're recommending regular check-ins to ensure their continued well-being and loyalty. Sir Edmund was already thinking several steps ahead. We need to consider how this might affect the letter's delivery to Prince Harry. If there's any chance that news of this conversation could reach him before or around the time he receives the letter, it could completely undermine its intended purpose. William felt the final pieces of his hope crumbling. You're right. If Harry learns that I discussed our private matters with staff, he'll see it as the ultimate betrayal. The letter will go from being an olive branch to being evidence of my complete disregard for his privacy. The irony was devastating. In his desperation to reach his brother, William had potentially destroyed any chance of reconciliation. The letter that was meant to heal their relationship might now become the very thing that made reconciliation impossible. We have a narrow window, Sir Edmund said, checking his watch. If we can ensure absolute containment of this information and deliver the letter without any reference to today's events, there's still a chance the original intent can be preserved. But even as he spoke those words, Sir Edmund knew that the situation had fundamentally changed. The letter was no longer just private correspondence between brothers. It was now a document that existed within the context of a security incident, complete with recordings, transcripts, and multiple witnesses. The olive branch that William had so carefully cultivated had become entangled in the very machinery of royal protocol and security that he had been trying to circumvent. His attempt to reach across the divide to his brother had instead created new divisions and complications that might prove impossible to overcome. As the afternoon wore on, with lawyers, security experts, and senior advisors being brought into the situation, William began to understand that his morning's emotional outburst had set in motion a series of events that were now beyond his control. The final olive branch was indeed gone, not because it had been rejected, but because it had become something entirely different from what he had intended. 3 weeks had passed since the incident in the guard station, and the weight of unintended consequences continued to grow heavier with each day. William found himself in the impossible position of waiting to see whether his carefully crafted letter would achieve its intended purpose or become the catalyst for an even deeper rift with his brother. The letter had been delivered to Harry through secure diplomatic channels, as originally planned. But the pristine envelope that Harry received in California carried with it an invisible burden that its sender could never have anticipated. Unknown to Harry, his brother's heartfelt words existed not just on the cream-colored paper, but in recordings, transcripts, and the memories of multiple witnesses. Sir Edmund had implemented what he called a containment protocol that required monthly security briefings for everyone who had been present during William's revelation. James Morrison and Sarah Chun had been reassigned to different duties, not as punishment, but as a precautionary measure to limit their ongoing exposure to the royal family's private moments. Margaret Walsh had classified the recordings under the highest security protocols available, ensuring that they were stored in systems that required multiple authorizations to access. Yet she knew that the existence of such documentation created its own vulnerabilities. In her years of security work, she had learned that secrets had a way of finding their way into the light, regardless of the precautions taken to protect them. For James Morrison, the burden of what he knew was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. In his decade of service, he had prided himself on being a silent guardian, someone who could be trusted with the royal family's safety and privacy. But the intimate details he had heard that morning in the guard station haunted him with their humanity and pain. During one of his regular psychological evaluations, required for all security personnel, James found himself struggling to maintain the facade of normalcy. "I sometimes wonder," he said carefully to Dr. Elizabeth Foster, the staff psychologist, "about the psychological cost of the positions we're asked to guard. Not the physical dangers, but the emotional isolation that seems to be part of their lives." Dr. Foster, who had clearance to know about the incident, understood the subtext of James's words. It can be difficult to witness pain and not be able to offer comfort, but our role is to protect, not to counsel or befriend. But what if protecting someone's physical safety conflicts with protecting their emotional well-being? James asked, the question revealing the depth of his internal conflict. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Harry had received his brother's letter with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. The words on the page were everything he had hoped to hear from William for months. Yet something about the timing and tone felt off to him. He shared his concerns with his wife, reading portions of the letter aloud and trying to understand why such heartfelt sentiments felt somehow hollow. "It's beautiful," his wife observed, "but it feels like he's apologizing for things you never accused him of. Some of these apologies are so specific, as if he's responding to conversations you two never had." Harry reread the letter for the dozenth time, focusing on a passage where William wrote about understanding the impossible position Harry had been in regarding family expectations. The phrase struck him as odd because he had never described his situation to William in those exact terms. It was accurate, but it wasn't language he remembered using in their previous conversations. There was also something in William's tone that suggested he was writing not just to Harry, but as if he were addressing a broader audience. The letter felt simultaneously personal and performative, as if William were conscious that his words might be subject to scrutiny beyond their private correspondence. Back in England, William was experiencing his own doubts about the letter's effectiveness. 3 weeks had passed without any response from Harry, not even a brief acknowledgement that the letter had been received. The silence felt more deafening than the arguments that had preceded their estrangement. During a private dinner with his father, William found himself struggling with the urge to reveal what had happened that morning in the guard station. King Charles had noticed the change in his eldest son's demeanor and had asked several times whether everything was all right. "I fear I may have made things worse with Harry," William admitted, choosing his words carefully. "I try to reach out to him, but I'm beginning to think that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. King Charles, who had his own complex relationship with both of his sons, offered what comfort he could. Healing takes time, William. Sometimes the gesture matters more than the immediate response. But William knew something his father didn't, that his gesture had been compromised before it ever reached Harry. The letter that was meant to be a private communication between brothers had become evidence in a security file, a document that existed within a larger context of institutional protocols and containment strategies. Sir Edmund continued to monitor the situation with growing concern. Intelligence reports from their security liaisons suggested that rumors were beginning to circulate within certain media circles about tensions within the royal family. While nothing specific had leaked about the guard station incident, the general atmosphere of speculation created additional vulnerabilities. We need to be prepared for the possibility that information about your conversation with the guards could eventually surface, Sir Edmund warned William during one of their weekly briefings. If that happens, we'll need to have a response strategy that protects both your privacy and the institution's reputation. The preparation of contingency plans for potential exposure only added to William's growing sense of dread. Each briefing, each security review, each reminder of the incident served to reinforce how far removed his letter had become from its original intention. Sarah Chun, in her new position in the castle's visitor services department, found herself constantly reminded of that morning when she interacted with tourists who spoke about the royal brothers. Visitors often asked about the relationship between William and Harry, and each inquiry felt like a small betrayal of the confidences she had been forced to keep. During one particularly difficult day, when a group of American tourists spent considerable time discussing the brothers' estrangement, Sarah had to excuse herself from duty early. The weight of knowing so much about their private pain, while being unable to correct misconceptions or offer context, was becoming unbearable. As autumn approached, William made a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. He decided to write a second letter to Harry. This one acknowledging that his previous communication may not have achieved its intended effect. But even as he composed this new letter, he was haunted by the knowledge that anything he wrote would exist within the context of that recorded conversation. The second letter was shorter and more direct. William wrote about the loneliness of their positions, about the way duty and expectation could corrupt even the most sincere attempts at communication. He wrote about the price they both paid for living in the public eye, and how that price seemed to include the ability to have genuine private relationships. Most importantly, he wrote about acceptance. If this letter, like my previous one, cannot bridge the distance between us, I want you to know that I accept that outcome. Sometimes the greatest act of love is recognizing when our efforts to fix something are only making it worse. When William finished this second letter, he sat in his study for a long time, holding it in his hands. Outside, the autumn wind was beginning to strip the leaves from the trees, a natural reminder that some things must end for new growth to eventually begin. The olive branch he had originally extended to Harry was indeed gone, not because it had been rejected, but because it had been transformed by circumstances beyond his control into something he never intended it to be. The recordings in Margaret Walsh's secure files stood as a testament to the price of vulnerability in a world where privacy was an illusion and every word could be scrutinized for its implications. Yet in accepting this loss, William began to find a different kind of peace. The failure of his olive branch had taught him something important about the nature of his position and the limitations it placed on his most human desires. Some bridges, he realized, couldn't be built with words alone, especially when those words could never truly be private. The final olive branch was gone, but perhaps, in time, new growth might emerge from the acceptance of that loss. The brothers' story was far from over, but it would have to be written under different terms than those William had originally hoped for. In a world where even the most private gestures became public property, love would have to find other ways to express itself. As winter approached the castle, William placed his second letter in a drawer rather than sending it. Some conversations, he had learned, were too important to risk to the machinery of protocol and procedure. The olive branch was gone, but the tree remained, waiting for a season when growth might once again be possible.